What starts as a routine response can become a career-defining catastrophe when assumption replaces procedure and pride replaces prudence. A routine encounter is supposed to be a sequence of methodical steps: identify, verify, document, and de-escalate. It is training distilled into habit, a rhythm designed to minimize mistakes and protect both the public and the officer. But when a single participant abandons that rhythm and opts instead for a narrative of suspicion, the encounter loses its axis, and everything that follows is skewed by that initial tilt. A car in a parking garage, a hurried officer, and a man who looks out of place are small inputs into a system that can amplify error if safeguards are not observed. Procedural shortcuts are deceptively small. A skipped verification here, a sarcastic assertion there, a refusal to consult available records or witnesses. These are not minor discretionary choices. They are the sedimentary layers that build into misconduct. In the garage that afternoon, a man in a classic car, a police unit in a hurry, and an officer who read threat into presence created a volatile chemistry. The officer saw an anomaly and filled the gaps with a story that suited his bias. Once the story was chosen, evidence that contradicted it was dismissed or reframed. That is the practical danger of deviating from process. Once narrative outruns proof, reversing course becomes psychologically and institutionally difficult. The physical act of arrest is dramatic and irreversible in its immediate human impact. Handcuffs bite into wrists, public humiliation is instant and viral in a recorded age, and the person cuffed is thrust into a system that tends to assume guilt once control is asserted. For the officer, the decision to apply force is often justified in the moment as necessary, protective, or simply efficient. In hindsight, those same decisions can be read as reckless, punitive, and career-ending. The evidence trail, body cam footage, witness video, registration records will later determine whether that force was warranted. When that trail undermines the officer's account, the consequences are profound. Internal discipline, criminal charges, civil suits, and the permanent erosion of personal reputation. Institutions respond to such errors in ways colored by their own incentives. A department focused on preserving reputation will seek containment or obfuscation. A department committed to accountability will pursue correction and transparency. The choice is consequential. Attempted cover-ups compound the initial harm and risk civil liability, federal investigation, and public outrage. Transparency, while painful in the short term, can salvage credibility and set a precedent that discourages future misconduct. Leadership decisions about how to handle an officer's misstep will ripple through the organization, affecting morale, recruitment, and community trust for years. For the person wrongly accused, the damage is immediate and visceral: fear, pain, and the indignity of having one's identity and integrity questioned. For the community, the event becomes a mirror reflecting trust or its absence. When routine procedures are abandoned, the social contract frays. And for the officer who made the choice, the fallout can be merciless: internal discipline, criminal charges, jury judgment, and the irreversible loss of a badge. The trajectory from routine to ruin is short when unchecked bias accelerates decisions that ought to be measured. Each misstep becomes a lesson for systems to tighten protocols, ensure independent review, and make evidence the controlling factor in decision-making rather than intuition or bravado. Each unchecked action invites scrutiny in a different form. Civil suits translate physical harm into legal liability. Media coverage amplifies personal stories into public crises. Policy reviews convert isolated incidents into training revisions and structural reforms. The officer who assumed guilt at the outset failed a basic professional test: to let evidence, not emotion, dictate action. That failure is often more telling than whatever motivated it: arrogance, fear, impatience, or cultural incentives toward spectacle instead of service. The path back from a career-ending mistake is narrow, and rebuilding trust requires institutional humility, visible accountability, and an honest confrontation with the cultural drivers that allowed the mistake to occur. An elderly man's calm, triggers an officer's worst decision. Calm can be a sort of inoculation against escalation, but it can also be misread. A composed demeanor in the face of accusation reveals a confidence that might unnerve an officer conditioned to expect fear or deflection. Where an officer anticipates panic, a serene reply becomes a dissonant note that demands resolution. Rather than allowing the facts to harmonize, some officers attempt to force compliance by rewriting the tempo of the interaction through assertive or violent means. This mismatch between expected and observed behavior can be a trigger for escalation precisely because it challenges the officer's internal script. The psychology behind that reaction is complex. Officers, like everyone, carry schemas, cognitive shortcuts that organize expectations about how people behave. When reality violates a schema, the brain seeks quick closure. Under stress, closure often defaults to control. Control looks like orders, force, and the rapid imposition of authority. The calm of an elderly subject does not fit the expected script, so the officer either reinterprets it as deception or doubles down on power to eliminate the cognitive dissonance. This is a human failure as much as a professional one. Stress narrows bandwidth, and under pressure, the simplest way to resolve unease is to assert dominance, even when that choice does not serve justice. Age amplifies the moral weight of the encounter. An older citizen, slower to anger and steadier in bearing, often expects to be treated with a baseline of respect given physical vulnerability. Protocols around vulnerable populations exist precisely because the physical and psychological costs of force are greater. When an officer allows impatience or prejudice to override those protocols, the cruelty is compounded. The images that circulate online do not merely show an arrest. They reveal a breach in social norms and professional standards. The elder's composure, meant to diffuse and humanize, instead becomes the flashpoint for an officer's worst decision, exposing how quickly power can be wielded without tempering judgment. The aftermath of such a misjudgment ripples outward. The community sees a respected elder treated as a suspect. Colleagues see a breach of conduct. Internal affairs see documentation that does not match the recorded facts. The officer, once emboldened by an imagined victory, now faces a cascade of accountability that may include criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the permanent loss of a career. The elder, who offered nothing but composure, becomes the central figure in a story about justice, accountability, and the need for systemic change. The incident highlights the difference between training and temperament, between what is written in manuals and what is practiced in the field. There is also a lesson here about institutional support and individual responsibility. Training that emphasizes restraint, bias recognition, and communication can mitigate scenarios where calm is misinterpreted as guilt. Supervisors who encourage pause and verification rather than performative dominance create a different operational default. And when mistakes do occur, a culture that rewards accountability over concealment ensures that justice serves the harmed, not merely the institution's short-term interest. The result is not only better outcomes for citizens, but a healthier, more resilient policing culture where calm is respected rather than punished. There is also a lesson here about institutional support and individual responsibility. Training that emphasizes restraint, bias recognition, and communication can mitigate scenarios where calm is misinterpreted as guilt. Supervisors who encourage pause and verification rather than performative dominance create a different operational default. And when mistakes do occur, a culture that rewards accountability over concealment ensures that justice serves the harmed, not merely the institution's short-term interest. The result is not only better outcomes for citizens, but a healthier, more resilient policing culture where calm is respected rather than punished, and the long-term legitimacy of the badge is preserved. When assumptions override evidence. Assumptions are mental shortcuts that help human beings function in an otherwise overwhelming world, but they are also the seeds of error when applied to moments that demand careful inquiry. In law enforcement, where split-second decisions can alter lives, assumptions can be particularly dangerous. An officer who interprets context through a narrow filter is at risk of converting suspicion into certainty without the intermediary step of verification. That afternoon in the Galleria's garage, the officer's need for a simple narrative preempted the hard work of gathering and weighing evidence, and that need is a recurring hazard across many types of policing encounters. The mechanics are subtle and often unconscious. Confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in ways that affirm existing beliefs, provides a comfortable mental path away from doubt. When an officer believes he has identified a suspect, his attention becomes selective. He notices the details that fit and disregards those that do not. A polished license and a registration card may be dismissed as sophisticated forgeries. Witness statements may be interpreted as collusion, and procedural discrepancies may be rationalized as resistance. This selective attention compounds the initial error, turning a reversible misjudgment into an institutionalized wrongdoing. The legal and moral consequences of such an inversion are severe. The justice system is predicated on the proposition that guilt must be proved, not assumed. When assumptions override evidence, the integrity of each subsequent step from arrest to reporting to prosecution is compromised. Arrests made on shaky presumptions lead to wrongful detention and civil liabilities. Reports written to fit a preconceived story transmute into perjury. And when internal oversight uncovers a pattern of such behavior, public trust evaporates more quickly than any single apology can restore. The systemic cost is measured in lawsuits, damaged community relations, and the erosion of procedural legitimacy. Combating this psychological hazard requires structural interventions that do not rely solely on individual virtue. Training can help by making officers aware of cognitive biases and rehearsing counterfactual thinking, the practice of actively considering alternative explanations. Supervision can demand corroboration, encourage a culture of second checks, and reward officers who demonstrate patience and thoroughness rather than theatrical displays of control. Body-worn technology and a transparent chain of evidence make it harder for assumptions to masquerade as facts, and clearer standards for escalation make it more likely that force will be reserved for genuine necessity. There are also organizational incentives to consider. When a precinct values arrest numbers and headline-grabbing statistics over careful investigations, it creates a perverse incentive structure that encourages assumptions to harden into actions. Metrics that measure quality of investigations, community satisfaction, and adherence to procedure shift attention from quantity to intent. Accountability systems that are timely and visible deter officers from leaning on assumption because the probability of detection and meaningful sanction increases. This recalibration requires leadership willing to accept short-term pain for long-term legitimacy. The human element cannot be ignored. Officers who take shortcuts are not always malicious. They may be fatigued, stressed, inexperienced, or operating under a culture that prizes bravado. Addressing underlying causes through mental health support, reasonable shift scheduling, better mentorship, and explicit consequences for misconduct reduces the likelihood that assumptions will be allowed to drive action. Communities, too, can participate by insisting on transparency and advocating for independent review mechanisms that hold institutions accountable while preserving due process. Structural reform can include mandatory cross-checks, independent audits, and transparent reporting that allow external stakeholders to see that assumptions are not allowed to calcify into actions. Such measures protect both the innocent and the profession by making evidence the non-negotiable standard of action rather than a pliable justification. Body cameras capture what words can't undo. Body-worn cameras and bystander recordings have transformed the modern public sphere, creating a new permanent record of events that once lived only in memory and testimony. Where once two conflicting accounts might have led to a tangle of credibility disputes, footage often provides an impartial chronology that clarifies sequence, tone, and action. But cameras do more than supply facts. They shift institutional incentives, alter public expectations, and create new responsibilities for officers and departments that did not exist a decade ago. The presence of a camera changes behavior in subtle but profound ways. For some officers, awareness of being recorded moderates conduct and encourages adherence to procedure. For others, it may provoke performative actions aimed at demonstrating dominance to an imagined audience. The technology is not a panacea. It is a tool that magnifies existing tendencies, for better or worse. Importantly, cameras capture more than just motion. They record the ambient sounds, the hesitations, the offhand comments, and the context that makes a scene comprehensible in ways written reports often cannot convey. When footage contradicts an officer's written report, the discrepancy becomes evidence of either error or dishonesty. In a system that expects reports to be truthful summaries of events, such inconsistencies demand explanation. They also empower accountability mechanisms, internal affairs investigations, civilian review boards, and prosecutors to pursue clarity. Video evidence can catalyze swift institutional responses because it makes the hidden seen and the private public. Departments that embrace footage as a path to learning rather than a threat often find it easier to integrate lessons into training and to rebuild trust after incidents. Beyond institutional consequences, recorded evidence reshapes public narrative. A single clip shared online can crystallize a collective judgment about an event and accelerate calls for reform. That speed is double-edged. It can pressure institutions to act, and it can rush judgments before full context is understood. Responsible handling of footage requires both timely disclosure and careful contextualization, so that the public can weigh what the video shows alongside corroborating facts. Transparency policies that set expectations about when and how footage is released help to balance public interest with investigatory integrity. Footage also has rehabilitative potential. When used in training, real recordings provide raw material for discussion about de-escalation, communication strategies, and split-second decision-making. They can teach recruits and veterans alike how minor choices escalate into major consequences. However, cameras alone do not teach empathy or eliminate bias. Their effectiveness depends on the culture around them, whether leaders use footage as a learning tool, a basis for punishment, or a means to deflect responsibility. The moral clarity provided by a camera must be matched by institutional courage to act when misconduct is revealed. Importantly, releasing footage must be balanced against privacy and investigative integrity. Rushed disclosure without context can inflame public sentiment, while delayed disclosure erodes trust. Policies that set clear timelines and protocols for evidence release create predictability and guardrails for both transparency and fairness. Continuing, silence is often misunderstood as weakness, surrender, or fear, especially in confrontational environments where authority expects immediate verbal compliance. Yet silence can be a deliberate act of control, a disciplined refusal to feed chaos. In moments of aggression, particularly when power is unevenly distributed, silence becomes a stabilizing force. It strips the aggressor of the reaction they seek and exposes the imbalance between authority exercised and authority deserved. In a charged encounter, words can be twisted, reframed, or weaponized, while silence stands as a fixed point, resistant to manipulation. Aggression thrives on engagement. It escalates when challenged emotionally and justifies itself when provoked verbally. Silence denies that fuel. For the person subjected to hostility, remaining quiet requires extraordinary restraint. It demands emotional regulation under pressure, an ability to prioritize long-term outcomes over immediate self-expression. This restraint is not passive, it is strategic. By offering no verbal resistance, no insult, no emotional counterattack, the silent individual limits the aggressor's options and exposes the disproportion of the response. In institutional encounters, silence also serves as a form of documentation. Cameras, witnesses, and environmental context record what words might otherwise distort. When an individual remains silent while complying physically, the contrast between behavior and response becomes stark. Aggression without provocation stands alone, unsupported by justification. Silence, in this sense, is evidentiary. It allows the record to speak for itself, uninterrupted by noise that could later be mischaracterized as resistance or hostility. Psychologically, silence can unsettle an aggressor. Many confrontational tactics rely on provoking fear, defensiveness, or submission. When those expected reactions do not appear, uncertainty creeps in. The aggressor may interpret calm silence as defiance, arrogance, or hidden threat, revealing more about their internal state than about the person before them. This misinterpretation often leads to escalation, not because the silent individual has done anything wrong, but because the aggressor feels a loss of narrative control. The discipline required to remain silent under pressure is cultivated over time. It is not instinctive. Human beings are wired to defend themselves verbally, to explain, to justify, to assert their identity when challenged. Choosing silence requires trust in process, in evidence, or in the inevitability of truth emerging later. It is a wager that restraint will ultimately be more powerful than reaction. This wager is not without risk, but when aggression is already unmoored from reason, verbal engagement often increases danger rather than resolving it. Silence also shifts moral weight. Observers, whether physically present or watching later through recordings, intuitively recognize imbalance. A person who does not shout, threaten, or insult, yet is met with force, occupies the moral high ground without declaring it. The absence of verbal retaliation highlights the excess of the response. In this way, silence becomes communicative, conveying dignity, self-possession, and credibility more effectively than any spoken defense. From a systemic perspective, silence exposes procedural failures. When an authority figure escalates despite compliance and absence of verbal resistance, it suggests that escalation was predetermined rather than situational. That realization forces institutions to confront uncomfortable questions about training, oversight, and culture. Silence does not merely protect the individual, it interrogates the system by refusing to play the role assigned to it. There is also a long-term dimension to silence. Words spoken in moments of stress can follow a person indefinitely, replayed, reframed, and judged out of context. Silence leaves no such residue. It denies future misrepresentation. When legal processes unfold, transcripts filled with restraint rather than confrontation carry weight. Silence preserved on record often becomes a form of testimony that cannot be impeached. Yet silence should not be romanticized as universally safe or appropriate. It is a tool, not a rule. Its effectiveness depends on context, visibility, and the presence of accountability mechanisms. Silence works best when there is some expectation that evidence will later be reviewed, that actions will be scrutinized, and that truth has an avenue for emergence. In environments where aggression operates without oversight, silence alone may not be sufficient protection. Still, when oversight exists, silence magnifies its power. The power of silence lies in its refusal to surrender dignity. It is a quiet assertion that one's humanity does not require permission, that one's worth is not contingent on convincing an aggressor in the moment. It is patience weaponized not for harm, but for preservation. In the face of aggression, silence holds space for truth to surface, for records to speak, and for accountability to follow. A single phone call that changes everything. There are moments when power shifts not through force or argument, but through connection. A single phone call can redraw the balance of an entire situation because it introduces context that authority cannot ignore. In systems built on hierarchy, relationships matter, titles matter, lines of communication matter. A phone call, placed at the right moment, can collapse false narratives and replace them with reality in seconds. The call itself is often unremarkable in form. A number dialed, a voice answered. What gives it weight is what it carries: identity, credibility, and access. It bypasses intermediaries, cuts through procedural delay, and introduces someone who cannot be dismissed. In situations where an individual has been rendered powerless by circumstance, the phone call becomes a lever, small but decisive, capable of moving structures that otherwise feel immovable. Psychologically, the impact of such a call on those who have overreached is immediate. Confidence built on assumptions falters when confronted with authority that outranks it. The certainty that fueled earlier aggression evaporates, replaced by calculation, fear, and retrospective awareness. The call forces a reevaluation of choices already made, and that reevaluation often comes too late to prevent consequences. The significance of the call is not merely who is on the other end, but what the call represents. It represents verification. It represents accountability entering the room. It signals that the situation is no longer contained within a single narrative or controlled environment. Once the call is made, the encounter is no longer private, no longer manageable through intimidation or procedural shortcuts. It is now part of a larger system with memory, oversight, and consequences. In institutional contexts, the phone call exposes structural vulnerabilities. It reveals how much authority depends on isolation, on the assumption that those subjected to it lack access to countervailing power. When that assumption proves false, the system must respond quickly, often clumsily, attempting to undo actions that cannot be undone. The scramble that follows such a call is telling. It reveals priorities, fears, and fault lines within the organization. The call also reframes time. What felt like a closed chapter becomes the opening of a longer process. Actions taken minutes earlier are now frozen in record, reinterpreted under new scrutiny. Statements made with confidence are revisited with caution. Decisions justified as routine are reclassified as reckless. The call does not erase what happened. It ensures that what happened will be examined. For the individual making the call, there is restraint embedded in the act. The call is not a demand for immediate retribution. It is an invocation of process. It hands the situation over to someone with the authority and obligation to respond appropriately. This delegation is powerful because it avoids emotional escalation while guaranteeing institutional response. The caller does not need to argue or threaten. The mere existence of the connection is sufficient. The presence of that connection also tests integrity. Systems that function properly should not require special access to correct wrongdoing. When a phone call becomes the catalyst for justice, it raises uncomfortable questions about equity and fairness. Would the same correction have occurred without that call? Would the same urgency have materialized if the individual lacked that connection? These questions linger long after the immediate crisis resolves. Till the call serves as a moment of truth. It strips away pretense and reveals how fragile abuse of authority really is when exposed to light. It demonstrates that power exercised without grounding in evidence or procedure is inherently unstable. One voice, recognized and respected, can cause an entire structure to recalibrate. The aftermath of such a call often unfolds in stages: shock, denial, containment, accountability. Each stage reflects a system grappling with its own failure. Attempts to minimize, reframe, or quietly resolve the issue may surface, but the initial call has already ensured visibility. What follows becomes a test of leadership and values. The call also transforms the narrative. What began as an accusation becomes an examination of conduct. The focus shifts from the person detained to the people who detained them. This inversion is profound. It reassigns scrutiny and redistributes vulnerability. Those who felt untouchable moments earlier now experience the uncertainty they imposed on someone else. A single phone call does not create justice on its own. It opens the door for it. It introduces the possibility of correction, not as a favor, but as an obligation. It reminds institutions that their authority is conditional, contingent on adherence to law, ethics, and accountability. Once that reminder is delivered, it cannot be unheard, and the consequences set in motion cannot be recalled. Power misused is fragile. The moment authority discovers its error is a pivot. Confidence dissolves, procedures scramble, and the facade of control fractures. Officers who felt untouchable confront a new landscape, where every decision will be parsed, recorded, and judged. That recognition sparks parallel dynamics, panic-driven cover-up attempts, and, if leadership chooses, a corrective cascade. Cover-up is a reflex. Rewind, erase, rewrite. But leadership that values legitimacy triggers transparency, evidence-led inquiry, and visible accountability. The panic phase reveals institutional priorities. Do we protect reputation or uphold the rule of law? How quickly supervisors move from containment to candor determines whether the episode deepens into crisis or becomes a moment of learning. The human toll is immediate: careers undone, trust ruptured, and a community watching how its protectors will respond. For the officer exposed, shock and shame are compounded by the realization that actions taken in a moment of assumed impunity carry permanent consequences. For colleagues, the event forces a recalibration of daily practice. For leadership, it is a test of integrity. The same cameras and records that convict missteps also offer a path to repair, if embraced honestly. Safety mechanisms exist to interrupt error: alerts, cross-checks, oversight flags, and clear escalation protocols. When these are bypassed or dismissed, failure becomes probable. A blinking warning ignored in a booking terminal, a supervisor's shrug, or a culture that prizes speed over verification signals deeper rot. Small rationalizations accumulate into patterns, reports tailored to fit narratives, evidence overlooked, and an erosion of the presumption that facts lead. Fixing this requires structural change, mandatory corroboration steps, independent audits, and transparent timelines for evidence release. Alongside cultural shifts that reward restraint and curiosity over bravado, technology can help only if paired with accountability. A flag that is routinely overridden becomes noise, not safety. Training must include cognitive bias awareness and practiced counterfactual thinking so that officers habitually consider alternative explanations before action. Metrics should measure investigatory quality and community trust, not just arrest counts. When systems designed to prevent error are ignored, the path to institutional recovery demands both policy recalibration and leadership willing to trade short-term optics for long-term credibility, because otherwise incentives will continue to nudge practitioners toward the path of least resistance. And oversight. When protocols give way to instinct, the result is predictable. Decisions shift from verifiable steps to personal judgment calls. Training exists to force evidence to lead. Identification, verification, documentation, but bias quietly reroutes that flow. An officer who substitutes narrative for corroboration transforms a neutral procedure into a moral hazard, interpreting compliance as deception and calm as guilt. That shift corrodes reports, warps testimony, and turns oversight into after-the-fact triage rather than prevention. Fixing it requires more than retraining. It demands metrics that value thoroughness over volume, supervision that enforces cross-checks, and a culture where questioning assumptions is standard operating practice rather than an act of disloyalty. When footage, phone logs, and witness accounts converge on misconduct, the precinct becomes public theater and private excuses dissolve. A leader's response in that moment defines institutional character. Concealment deepens crisis, transparency begins repair. Public airing forces accountability. Internal investigations, criminal referrals, policy overhauls, and exposes whether the department prioritizes reputation or justice. The spectacle also educates. Recruits see consequences. Veterans face reappraisal, and the community evaluates legitimacy. That reckoning can catalyze durable reform if it is followed by clear policy change, independent review, victim-centered remedies, and leadership willing to trade short-term optics for long-term trust, demanding systemic fixes where justice rarely arrives on the schedule people expect. It moves at the speed of institutions, procedures, filings, reviews, and appeals, and that slowness can feel indistinguishable from indifference to those who have been harmed. Time stretches in waiting rooms, in quiet cells, in the long silence after an incident when nothing seems to be happening. Yet, the absence of immediate consequence does not mean absence of consequence altogether. Justice that is delayed often gathers weight as it moves, accumulating documentation, testimony, and scrutiny that make its eventual arrival far more forceful than any instant reaction could have been. The early phase after a serious misuse of authority is often characterized by denial and minimization. Language becomes evasive. Words like misunderstanding, isolated incident, and procedural error are deployed to soften what the evidence plainly shows. This stage is not accidental. It is an institutional reflex aimed at buying time. Time allows narratives to be tested, shaped, or quietly abandoned. It also allows those involved to hope that attention will fade. But time also works in the opposite direction. Records remain. Footage does not forget. Witnesses compare notes. Independent investigators begin to assemble timelines that are immune to spin. As the process unfolds, pressure builds unevenly. For those who experienced the harm, the weight can be exhausting, forcing them to relive the event through statements, depositions, and hearings. For those responsible, the delay can initially feel like relief, a belief that survival is possible if the storm passes. This asymmetry is deceptive. The longer justice takes, the more comprehensive it often becomes. Initial allegations mature into charges. Administrative reviews evolve into criminal investigations. Civil suits expose patterns rather than single acts. What began as one incident becomes representative of something larger. Courtrooms are where slowness transforms into severity. Judges and juries are not bound by the emotional immediacy of the original encounter. They operate with distance, evidence, and standards that strip away justifications offered in the heat of the moment. They ask different questions, not what did you fear, but what did you do? Not what did you assume, but what did you verify? When answers fall short, sentencing reflects not just the act, but the breach of trust it represents. Authority misused is punished not only for its outcome, but for the precedent it threatens to set. Our justice is rarely theatrical. It is procedural, methodical, and final. Careers end not with shouting, but with signatures. Freedom is lost not in chaos, but in quiet courtrooms where decisions are read into record. The severity lies in permanence. Licenses revoked, pensions forfeited, records marked. The slow grind ensures that consequences are durable and difficult to reverse. This is not vengeance, it is containment. It signals to others in similar positions that misuse of power carries costs that extend far beyond the momentary satisfaction of control. For institutions, hard justice is both corrective and instructive. It forces policy revisions, training overhauls, and leadership changes that would never occur without external pressure. Consent decrees, federal oversight, and mandatory reporting structures emerge from prolonged cases that expose systemic weaknesses. These changes are rarely swift, but once imposed, they reshape behavior across entire organizations. The pain of reform is distributed widely, touching those who did nothing wrong alongside those who did. That collective discomfort is part of the deterrent effect, a reminder that individual actions can trigger consequences for many. Public perception evolves alongside the process. Initial outrage may cool, but it is replaced by a more sober assessment of whether systems work. When justice finally arrives, its credibility depends on transparency and proportionality. Excessive leniency undermines trust. Excessive severity raises questions of scapegoating. Hard justice occupies a narrow lane where accountability feels earned, grounded in evidence rather than optics. When achieved, it can restore a measure of confidence not because it erases harm, but because it demonstrates that harm is not ignored. There is also a personal reckoning embedded in delayed justice. Those found responsible must sit with their actions for months or years before consequence is imposed. That time can harden denial or foster reflection. Some use it to rationalize, others to confront what they did. The law does not require remorse, but society often watches for it as a signal of understanding. Whether remorse appears or not, the outcome remains. Justice that comes hard does not negotiate with feelings, it responds to facts. For the harmed, delayed justice offers a different challenge: endurance. Endurance in telling the same story repeatedly. Endurance in watching proceedings that seem disconnected from lived experience. Endurance in trusting that persistence will matter. When the final judgment is rendered, it rarely heals everything, but it affirms reality. It says the harm was real, the wrongdoing recognized, and the response measured. That affirmation has value even when scars remain. Justice that does not come fast often comes with breadth. It reaches supervisors who enabled, systems that failed, and cultures that tolerated. It does not stop at the first link in the chain. This expansiveness is what makes it hard. It demands institutional introspection rather than symbolic sacrifice. It forces a reckoning with incentives, oversight, and leadership choices that allowed misconduct to occur. In doing so, it reshapes future behavior more effectively than any immediate punishment could have. A new standard is born from one man's ordeal. Out of individual suffering, standards sometimes emerge, not because pain is noble, but because it exposes gaps that abstraction hides. An ordeal forces specificity. It identifies exactly where processes fail, where discretion becomes danger, and where silence enables harm. When institutions respond honestly, those specifics are translated into rules, training modules, and expectations that did not exist before. A new standard is not a slogan, it is a checklist informed by failure. Such standards often begin informally: a lesson discussed in briefings, a case study circulated among trainees, a supervisor reminding officers that every encounter carries unseen context. Over time, these lessons crystallize into policy. They become requirements rather than suggestions. Documentation becomes more rigorous. Verification steps multiply. Escalation thresholds are clarified. What was once left to individual judgment is now bounded by shared expectation. The ordeal becomes a reference point, shorthand for what must not happen again. A meaningful standard shifts perspective. It asks practitioners to imagine each encounter from the vantage point of accountability rather than authority. Would this action withstand review? Would it make sense to someone who was not there? Would it look reasonable on camera, in court, years later? These questions slow decision-making just enough to reintroduce judgment where impulse once dominated. The standard does not eliminate discretion, it disciplines it. Standards born from harm also influence culture. They redefine what earns respect within an organization. Where bravado once carried status, restraint gains value. Where numbers once mattered most, quality begins to count. New metrics follow. Commendations recognize de-escalation. Promotions weigh judgment as heavily as enforcement. These shifts are subtle but cumulative, altering what younger members emulate and what veterans model. For communities, a new standard offers a language to articulate expectations. It moves dialogue beyond vague demands for change to concrete benchmarks. Did officers verify before acting? Did supervisors intervene when alerts appeared? Did leadership disclose information promptly? Standards provide a framework for accountability that is less reactive and more predictive. They allow trust to be rebuilt incrementally through consistency rather than promises. The person whose ordeal catalyzed the standard often occupies an uncomfortable position. They become a symbol without seeking to be one. Their experience is cited in trainings and reports, sometimes reduced to bullet points. This abstraction can feel alienating, yet it also ensures that what happened to them is not isolated. The ordeal gains purpose beyond itself, embedded in practices that protect others. That transformation does not erase trauma, but it situates it within a larger narrative of prevention. Standards must be enforced to matter. Written rules without consequences are ceremonial. Enforcement requires leadership willing to act when standards are breached, even when doing so is inconvenient or politically costly. Consistency is critical. Selective enforcement undermines credibility faster than no enforcement at all. When standards are applied evenly, they become internalized, shaping behavior even in the absence of supervision. Over time, a standard can migrate beyond its origin. Other departments adopt similar policies. Accrediting bodies incorporate them. Courts reference them when evaluating reasonableness. What began as a response to one ordeal influences practice far beyond its initial context. This diffusion is how systemic change occurs, incrementally, through replication and normalization. A new standard is not static. It evolves as new scenarios test its limits, feedback loops refine it, data reveals unintended consequences, adjustments are made. The standard remains anchored, however, in the lesson that produced it, that unchecked assumptions and unexamined authority cause harm. Remembering that origin matters. It keeps the standard grounded in lived reality rather than abstract compliance. The endurance of such a standard depends on memory. Institutions forget easily. Turnover, shifting priorities, and external pressures can erode commitment. Sustaining change requires continual reinforcement through training, evaluation, and leadership example. When the standard is invoked not only after failure, but before action, it fulfills its purpose. It becomes part of how decisions are made, rather than a reminder of what went wrong, shaping future encounters so that dignity, verification, and accountability are treated not as exceptions, but as defaults woven into everyday practice and carried forward into moments that have not yet happened, guiding choices in ways that remain invisible unless tested by pressure, ensuring that the lesson learned through one man's ordeal continues to influence decisions quietly, persistently, and across time, as part of an institutional conscience that resists erosion and adapts without forgetting why it exists, anchoring behavior to principles rather than impulse, and creating a living expectation that every action must be defensible, not just in the moment, but in hindsight, in review, and in the broader judgment of a society that entrusts authority with power only so long as that power is exercised with care, humility, and an awareness of the human cost when standards fail. If this story held your attention, it's because it touches something deeper than entertainment. It asks what power is supposed to look like when no one is watching, and what responsibility comes with it when everything is being recorded. Stories like this don't end when the screen goes dark. They continue in the conversations we have and the standards we expect. If you believe narratives like this matter, support the work by subscribing to the channel. Each subscription tells the algorithm that stories about accountability, justice, and consequence deserve to be seen, not buried. Liking the video helps more people find it, and sharing it keeps the conversation alive beyond this space. Now, your perspective matters. Was the outcome justice or just the beginning of accountability? Where do you think the line should be drawn between authority and restraint? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This channel isn't just a broadcast, it's a discussion. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story, because the next one may challenge what you think you already understand. And remember, silence protects abuse, but attention changes outcomes. Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay here.